If you've ever been underestimated, discarded by the very people meant to love you, then this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe, and settle in, because what I did to my corrupt, elitist family is nothing short of war. There are many kinds of prisons. Some have walls and bars. Others are made of polished floors, chandelier lighting, and a family name spoken with pride by strangers and shame by your own blood. Mine was the second kind. I grew up in a house with more bedrooms than memories. The kind of home people slowed their cars in front of just to stare at. Gated, silent, filled with art none of us really liked. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Clean lines, old money, cold hearts. My father was a titan in the world of business and real estate. Ruthless but charming. My mother, elegant, poised, loved by magazines and society columns. And then there were my siblings. Nathaniel, the heir to it all, born with the confidence of a king. And Celia, the angel child, always smiling, always praised, always right. And then there was me, Zane, not the prodigy, not the charmer, not even the troublemaker, just the quiet one, the forgettable one, the disappointment who somehow kept breathing. You'd think that in a house that rich, with all that privilege, love would come easy. But it didn't. Not for me. My childhood wasn't filled with shouting or bruises or locked doors. It was something far worse. It was filled with silence. A silence that didn't comfort. It erased. My earliest memories are quiet ones. Sitting in the back seat of a car while my siblings laughed up front. Walking into a room and watching conversations die mid-sentence. Dinners where everyone was served but me, and no one noticed until dessert. If they noticed at all. My father barely spoke to me unless it was to correct or dismiss. My mother smiled at me like I was someone else's child, someone she had to tolerate because the world was watching. And my siblings? They learned from the best. Nathaniel mocked me with practiced cruelty. Celia ignored me with perfect grace. There was one night in particular that cemented everything. It was the annual winter banquet, a family tradition that doubled as a networking opportunity for my father. The guest list read like a political fundraiser: senators, CEOs, old money wrapped in expensive suits and cocktail dresses. The house was lit up like a museum, staff buzzing from room to room, musicians tuning string instruments in the hallway. I was 17, old enough to know I didn't belong, young enough to still hope I did. Dinner was a grand affair. Long table, candlelight, expensive wine. I was seated at the far end, barely within earshot of the main conversation, next to a hedge fund manager's bored wife who spent the night checking her phone. Halfway through the meal, the senator seated beside my father raised his glass and smiled. "You've got quite the legacy here, Robert," he said. "Your son's making headlines already." Nathaniel beamed. My father nodded, proud. The room leaned in. "And what about your other boy?" the senator asked, glancing down the table toward me. "Zane, right?" I looked up, surprised. It was the first time someone had acknowledged me that night. My father didn't even look my way. He waved a dismissive hand. "Zane's still searching for what he's good at," he said, light laugh in his voice. "We're just hoping he finds it before 30. Laughter followed. Thin, polite. Except for me. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at my plate. My hands were shaking. I didn't eat another bite. No one noticed. After dinner, while the adults sipped brandy and discussed political donations, I slipped away. I found myself in the service stairwell, the place I always retreated to. It was narrow, a bit dusty, used by staff more than family. I liked it for one reason. No one ever followed me there. I sat on the steps and stared at the wood grain on the wall until my vision blurred. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just unwanted. I was invisible. I had spent years trying to earn their respect, their approval, even a fraction of their affection. But I wasn't Nathaniel. I wasn't Celia. I wasn't useful. I was the placeholder, the forgotten draft in a family masterpiece. After that night, I stopped trying. I stopped speaking at dinner. I stopped attending events. I became exactly what they treated me like, a ghost in the house. And in that silence, I started asking myself questions I hadn't dared to before. What if they were right about me? What if I was destined for nothing? What if this was all I'd ever be? That kind of thinking is dangerous. It eats at you. But somewhere in the quiet of that stairwell, between the taste of shame and the numbness of being erased, something else was born in me. Not rage. Not yet. Resolve. Not to prove them wrong, but to disappear on my own terms. It started as a thought. A fantasy, really. What if I left and never looked back? What if I built something without their name, their money, their shadow? Would I still exist? The fantasy turned into research. Research turned into plans. I started waking up early, running, training, studying, not for school, but for myself. The gym became my church. The early morning frost became my only honest friend. One morning, I passed by the office downtown and saw a recruitment poster in the window. It was simple, bold font, strong faces, the promise of something earned, not given. I stood there for a long time, staring at it like it held a secret meant only for me. The next day, I walked into the recruitment office and signed the paperwork. No one in my family knew. I didn't tell them. I didn't need their permission. I was 18. The night before I left, I wrote a note. It wasn't dramatic, just a few sentences. I've joined the army. Don't look for me. I'll find my own way. I left on my bed. I didn't pack much, just enough to get by. I walked out the front door at 4 a.m. The sky was still dark. The estate was silent. No one stopped me. No one noticed. No one called. Not that day. Not the next. Not for weeks. And in that silence, I finally found something I had never been given. Freedom. I didn't know where it would take me. I didn't know if I'd make it. But I knew one thing for sure. I was done being a ghost. The first thing I noticed was the sand. Not just the color or the heat. Those came later. It was the way it got everywhere. Into your eyes. Your ears. Between your teeth. It coated everything. Like the past you couldn't shake, no matter how many times you tried to scrub it away. Fort Benning wasn't hell, but it taught you what hell might feel like. We were nothing more than bodies at first. Numbers on a roster, stripped of names, stripped of comfort, stripped of whatever version of ourselves we clung to before stepping through those gates. I arrived with a duffel, silence in my chest, and no expectations. I didn't need to prove anything. Not anymore. I wasn't trying to be seen. I was just trying to survive. The other recruits were nervous, chattering, sizing each other up. I stayed quiet. Always had. That hadn't changed. But this time it wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Observation. Within a day, I learned everything I needed to know. The loud ones broke first. The cocky ones talked until their voices cracked. The arrogant ones collapsed under pressure. And the ones who laughed through drills, they cried the hardest in the dark. Me? I endured. I ran until my legs gave out. I crawled until the skin on my elbows split. I woke before the whistle and fell asleep without dreams. Pain wasn't punishment. It was proof that I could still feel, that I was still moving. No one cared where you came from. That was the beauty of it. There were no fathers with power here. No mothers with charity galas. No family names to weaponize. Just sweat, breath, failure, and repetition. And slowly I started to change. I didn't notice it at first, but others did. The instructors watched me. They didn't compliment. They never did. But their eyes stayed on me longer. When others stumbled, they cursed. When I stumbled, they waited to see if I get back up. I always did. There was one drill, night navigation. It was designed to disorient. A maze in the woods, maps, coordinates, silence, and miles of thick darkness. I volunteered to go first. 2 hours in, I was still moving. I heard whispers later. Some recruits thought I'd quit, gotten lost, failed. But I wasn't lost. I was free. Free from voices, from judgment, from anything that looked like home. I emerged just before dawn, covered in dirt, compass in hand. The instructor didn't say a word, just looked at me for a long second and gave a slow nod. That was the moment I knew I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was becoming something else. Something sharp, silent, solid. In the barracks, I didn't make friends easily. I wasn't unfriendly, I just didn't need the noise. But there was one guy, Mendoza, built like a wall, with a laugh too loud for the room. He started talking to me during weapons training, asking where I was from. Nowhere, I said. He laughed like it was a joke. Yeah, me too, man. I got no map behind me. Just a mission in front. We ended up bunking near each other. He talked enough for both of us, and somehow that worked. He never pushed for stories, just shared his own. One night, He told me about his brother, lost to gang violence, wrong place, wrong time. Said the army gave him a reason not to burn everything down. That stuck with me. We all had reasons for being there. None of them patriotic. Not really. Some came for escape. Others for redemption. A few for revenge. I was there because I didn't belong anywhere else. About 6 weeks in, I got called into the CO's office. I thought I was in trouble. Instead, he handed me a folded paper. My first evaluation. I scanned the page. Field performance. Exceptional. Leadership initiative. High potential. Stress response. Optimal. He looked up and studied me. You've got the edge, he said. But edge alone isn't enough. You need direction. Purpose. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. He leaned forward. You ever think about going officer? That word hit differently. Officer. I had never been anything with authority in my life. Never been trusted, respected. Certainly never led anyone. But something in me cracked open when he said it. Like the idea had been hiding there all along, waiting for permission to surface. I nodded once. Then act like it, he said. You start shaping up now, mentally, tactically, relationally, or you'll plateau like the rest. You want command? Earn it. I left his office changed. It wasn't about the title. It was about building something no one could take from me. A reputation forged by sweat, not surname. A place where what I did finally mattered. From that day on, I trained harder. I volunteered for extra drills. I studied in silence while the others joked in the mess hall. I pushed my body until it trembled, then pushed it more. I read manuals late into the night, not because I had to, but because I couldn't stop. The transformation wasn't quick, but it was constant. By the end of basic, I wasn't just another recruit. I was the one others followed without question. Even Mendoza said it once, walking back from the range. Man, you don't say much, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. But when you do, people listen. I hadn't realized that until he said it. But it was true. In a world where action mattered more than noise, I was finally being heard. At graduation, there were cheers. Families. Photos. Some guys had whole crowd show up. I had no one. Not a single call. Not even a card. But I didn't care. I stood tall in that uniform, not for them, but for myself. And in that moment, I made a silent vow. I would never go back to who I was. I would rise. I would lead. And one day, when I had the power, I would face the people who tried to bury me in silence and make sure they heard my name loud and clear. War has a way of simplifying things. There's no time for confusion when bullets are flying. No space for ego when lives are on the line. Everything sharpens down to one thing: survival. And in survival, the truth about a person is revealed. After basic training, I advanced through selection faster than anyone expected. I was steady, efficient, unshaken in chaos. They called it composure. I call it detachment. It wasn't that I was fearless. I had just already lived through the worst kind of abandonment, being forgotten by your own blood. Nothing else could touch that kind of pain. I entered officer school with a quiet resolve, not to lead out of ambition, but because I couldn't stand watching people suffer under poor leadership. I had spent my life following the wrong kind of power. Now I wanted to build the kind that lifted others. By 25, I'd earned my first command. A small unit in a volatile zone overseas. Rural, scorched, unpredictable. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. My men came from every background imaginable. Ex-mechanics, former street kids, academics who got lost somewhere after college. What united us was simple. We didn't quit. Not on ourselves. Not on each other. We patrolled villages where no one smiled and roads where every step could be your last. We were constantly on edge, constantly outnumbered, but we held. And we grew. Not because of me, but because I listened. I didn't bark orders. I asked questions. I learned every man's strength, every weakness. I didn't lead from the front to prove anything. I led because I couldn't bear to ask someone to do something I wouldn't do myself. One night, during a routine resupply mission, everything went wrong. The truck ahead of us hit an IED. The explosion ripped through the silence like a scream. Shrapnel rained down. Smoke filled the air. My ears rang for what felt like hours. One of my men, Foster, was trapped under the twisted metal. Flames crawled toward the fuel line. I didn't think. I moved, crawled through glass and fire, yanked him free by sheer will. My hands were blistered, my side torn open, but we made it out alive. All of us. The next morning, I was flown out for treatment. The burns weren't too severe. The doctors were impressed I'd made it back upright. I didn't care about the scars. What mattered was Foster lived. The whole team did. Weeks later, back on base, I was called into the commander's office. Thought I'd screwed up again. Instead, I was handed a commendation. Exceptional field leadership, the report read. Tactical courage under fire. Unit cohesion maintained under extreme duress. It was the first time anyone had ever used the word exceptional about me. And they meant it. That day, I stood alone in my quarters, holding the medal in my hand, and realized something that shook me deeper than any explosion ever could. I was proud of myself, not for surviving, but for becoming someone who others could count on. I mailed the medal to Mendoza, now stationed at another base, with a note, "You'd better not die before I outrank you." He sent back a candy bar and a note that just said, "Too late. You're already the guy they talk about in training briefs." But with pride came clarity, and with clarity came memory. It started with a letter. It arrived unmarked, no return address. Just my name. I opened it with casual curiosity. Inside was a single page, handwritten, from someone I hadn't thought about in years. Her name was Liza. She used to work in our household when I was a child, one of the few people who ever spoke to me with kindness. She disappeared when I was 10, dismissed suddenly, no explanation. I hadn't seen or heard from her since. Her handwriting was shaky. "Zane, you don't know me anymore, but I remember you. I see your name in the news now. Lieutenant, a real man. I write not to reconnect, but to warn you. Your father, he's not just cruel, he's dangerous. I know things. I kept quiet for years because I was scared, but I'm dying now, and I can't carry it anymore. What they built, your family's wealth, it's all lies. Fraud, manipulation, theft. Your father ruined people. Your mother covered all. You deserve to know. I hope one day you make things right. Liza." I read the letter 5 times. It didn't make sense at first, not because it was hard to believe, but because I had always known something was rotten at the core of that house. I just never had proof. And now, here it was. The past wasn't done with me. My father wasn't just emotionally abusive. He was a criminal. And my mother, graceful, polished, smiling at charity events, was complicit. I sat with the letter in my lap, staring at the wall, and a feeling began to rise in my chest. It wasn't rage. That would come later. What I felt first was betrayal, all over again. Because even after I escaped them, even after I built a new life, their darkness still cast a shadow over me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing my father's face at that banquet table. Smug, unbothered, speaking about me like I was already a lost cause. And for the first time, I thought about what it would mean not just to heal, but to hold him accountable. I didn't want revenge for the sake of pain. I wanted justice. Real justice. Not the kind that came in family shaming or angry outbursts. The kind that burned paper empires down to the last brick. I folded the letter, tucked it into a notebook, and sat in the dark until dawn. I had always thought my story would end with silence. But now I realized it was just beginning. The letter from Liza didn't just reopen a wound. It changed the shape of my memory. I started seeing things differently. The lavish parties I'd snuck past as a child, thinking they were just adult vanity, now pulsed with darker meaning. The parade of powerful guests, the late-night arguments behind closed doors, the safe in my father's office he guarded like a war chest. None of it felt random anymore. They weren't just rich. They were careful, and careful people usually have something to hide. I couldn't go back to being the soldier who left it all behind. Not now. Not with the truth whispering from every corner of my past. I needed answers. I started simple, quiet. I requested 2 weeks of personal leave under the pretense of visiting an old unit friend in a rehab facility. No one questioned it. I'd earned that kind of space. But I didn't fly out to any hospital. I flew to D.C. I knew that if I wanted to expose people like my parents, I had to think bigger than anger. I had to think like a tactician, not in bullets, but in blueprints. I had no legal experience, no investigative training. But what I did have was a network, officers, analysts, friends who owed favors, men and women who trusted me with their lives. And I knew how to build a team. The first call I made was to Grant. Major Alexander Grant. We met during a NATO coordination op 5 years back. He was sharp, measured, and ruthless in all the right ways. Since retiring, he moved into private investigations, mostly doing contract work for law firms digging into corporate fraud. I told him I needed help. I didn't tell him everything at first, just that I believed someone close to me had buried years of financial crimes behind layers of forged charities and shell companies. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Where do we start?" Within days, we were operating out of a small, rented townhouse in Arlington, surrounded by corkboards, files, and laptops. It felt like planning for war, because in a way it was. My father, Edward Langston, had always prided himself on being a self-made legacy. The phrase made me nauseous. The truth was that his first millions came from insider real estate deals and well-timed gifts to zoning officials. From there, he built Langston Holdings, an umbrella company housing dozens of subsidiaries in real estate, consulting, and philanthropy. My mother ran the charitable foundation side, elegant, untouchable, and praised in social columns for her tireless efforts for the community. It didn't take long before cracks started showing. Grant and I began mapping their network. Dozens of LLCs in tax haven states, international transfers that didn't line up, and most damning of all, a series of real estate flips purchased by shell corporations and resold at fake inflated values to related entities. It was textbook laundering, a $100 million empire sitting on rot. And if you traced it far enough, you found pain. Foreclosed families, evicted tenants, stolen pensions, silent ruin, all engineered to keep my family's name polished and powerful. Grant looked at me across the table one night as we sorted through a pile of subpoenaed tax forms. "You know," he said, "this is going to end with someone in prison." "I know," I replied. "Maybe more than one." I hope so. I wasn't doing this for revenge anymore. Not entirely. I was doing this because people had suffered while I looked away. Because somewhere a kid like me might still be sitting at a cold dinner table, learning the wrong lesson about power. I would not let it continue. But legal takedowns required patience. So I kept my uniform clean, attended my post, waited, gathered, connected dots, fed what we found to a select team of lawyers who owed favors for military service, journalists who'd been stonewalled by Langston PR firms, and one trusted agent at the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. The most damning piece came from an anonymous envelope. Inside were scanned documents, emails between my father and a sitting state senator. Explicit language about vote buying, tax avoidance, and offshore accounts. It was nuclear. I didn't know who sent it, but I knew what to do with it. Grant and I packaged the file into a clean, anonymous report and sent it to every oversight body we could think of: federal investigators, financial crimes units, even a whistleblower contact in the Treasury Department. We didn't sign it. We didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any name ever could. Within weeks, the first domino fell. The senator was indicted for bribery. The story made national news. Langston Holdings stock dropped 14% overnight. My parents stayed silent at first. Then came the press statement, full of denial and distraction, blaming coordinated attacks and politically motivated investigations. But their faces told a different story. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in their eyes. The wolves were at the door, and I wasn't finished. I wasn't just going to expose the business. I was going to strip them of the myth. My mother's charity foundation, the one that hosted galas, funded museums, and posed for photographers, was next. Grant and I found invoices for events that never happened. Receipts for lavish private dinners filed under outreach. Payments to speakers who never showed. Dozens of them. The entire operation was a cover. A tax write-off machine built to mask money laundering and reputation laundering in equal parts. We packaged the evidence into another anonymous brief and sent it directly to 3 journalists who had previously written glowing profiles on my mother. 2 of them ignored it. The third didn't. Her name was Marissa Elling, investigative reporter, unrelenting. Within days, she called the foundation for comment. Within weeks, she published a 4,000-word expose titled, "The Charity That Wasn't: Inside the Langston Family's Philanthropic Mirage." My mother's image shattered. Sponsors pulled out. Invitations disappeared. Her name was quietly removed from a board of directors she'd chaired for 15 years. They tried to spin it. She released a video statement, teary-eyed, claiming she had been misled by accountants. But no one bought it. Not anymore. People wanted accountability. And I was just getting started. Because the final blow wasn't going to come from the shadows. It was going to come from me. Face to face. But first, I had to make sure they had nowhere left to run. It wasn't pride I felt when the federal indictment dropped. It was stillness. Like the silence before a storm finally breaks. The news broke just before noon. The headlines raced across every major outlet, every financial ticker. Langston Holdings CEO Edward Langston indicted for wire fraud, money laundering, and bribery. I was sitting in the same Arlington townhouse I'd rented with Grant months earlier, watching the news cycle implode in real time. I'd already known what was coming, of course. I'd helped engineer it. But the sight of my father's face splashed across the screen, no longer revered but reviled, felt surreal. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just breathed. The press swarmed the Langston estate. News vans lined the street I used to bike down as a kid. Drones hovered above the mansion gates. The camera caught my father in his tailored suit being escorted by federal agents, jaw locked tight, lips refusing to speak. My mother wasn't at his side. She was already unraveling on her own. The foundation had collapsed weeks earlier, and with it, the carefully constructed narrative of the beloved Langston matriarch. Her name was being dragged through every talk show, every op-ed column, every corner of the internet that had once praised her charm and elegance. The world that had applauded her was now devouring her. And I still hadn't said a word publicly. That silence wouldn't last, because the next move was mine. I contacted my attorney, a former military JAG turned corporate ethics prosecutor named Dana Rourke. She joined my team quietly months ago. Smart, composed, and ethically unshakable. I trusted her with everything. "I want to meet them," I said. She didn't need to ask who. Face to face. Yes. Why? They need to know it was me. Not just the public. Them. My father. My mother. I want them to see what they created and what they couldn't destroy. Roar paused. "Then we'll do it on our terms." 2 days later, she arranged it. Private, off record, in the office of a federal mediation room. Not for legal negotiation, but as part of a courtesy debrief my parents foolishly agreed to under the assumption I was a witness helping prosecutors. They still didn't know the full scope of my involvement. Not yet. When I walked into that room, my mother looked up first. Her face didn't change. Not visibly, but her eyes flickered. She hadn't seen me in over a decade. Last time I was 19, standing awkwardly near the garden steps while she air-kissed guests. This time, I walked in with the posture of an officer and the presence of someone who no longer feared being forgotten. My father's gaze sharpened. He sat straight, unmoved, trying to read me. I sat across from them, silently. "You," he said finally, "what the hell is this?" My mother broke the silence with something colder. "Is this your idea of vengeance?" "No," I said. "This is justice." She scoffed. "After all these years, you come crawling back." "I didn't crawl," I said. "I climbed. While you lied, I led. While you stole, I served." My father's voice cut in, sharp and defensive. "You have no idea what you've done. You've destroyed the name that raised you. Your own family. You destroyed that name long before I did," I said. I just took off the mask. He slammed his palm on the table. "You think you're better than us? You think you could just waltz in here and lecture the people who built an empire?" "No," I said. "I don't think I'm better than you. I know I am, because I built something that didn't require lies to stand upright." My mother leaned in. "So what now? You parade your triumph on social media? Give smug interviews to talk show hosts?" I looked at her evenly. "No, I won't give a single interview. I don't want fame. I want peace. Something you never taught me how to find." There was a moment of stillness. Realization washed over them like ice. They finally understood. This wasn't about scandal, or press, or public shaming. This was personal. They hadn't just been brought down. They'd been undone. And by the sun, they had tried to erase. I stood to leave. I didn't come here for apologies. And I don't expect redemption. That's something you'll have to find or die without. My father's voice cracked slightly, the first hint of wear. You think this ends us? It already has. I walked out. I never saw them in person again. In the weeks that followed, Langston Holdings filed for bankruptcy. Assets were seized. Offshore accounts frozen. Investigations snowballed. My father was denied bail. My mother, never charged criminally, retreated into seclusion, abandoned by the high society she once ruled. Their empire didn't just fall. It bled publicly, and I made sure those wounds were never allowed to close. But revenge, real revenge, wasn't just in the takedown. It was in the rebirth. And that part of my journey was just beginning. The headlines faded. The court dates passed. The public's appetite for scandal turned to newer, shinier chaos. But I wasn't done. My family's empire lay in ruins, stripped, exposed, and bankrupt in both finance and soul. But in that rubble, there were pieces left behind. Not just stocks or real estate, but something far heavier. Responsibility. Every cent my parents hoarded came at someone else's expense. It was blood money, carved from silent suffering, unpaid labor, forced evictions, fraudulent investment schemes. Families ruined, veterans conned, widows left with nothing but apologies. I couldn't undo the past, but I could break the cycle. I sat alone in my father's former office, now seized by the feds and eventually handed over to bankruptcy trustees. But through legal arrangements I made early with Dana Rourke and a quiet bid through a trust not bearing my name, I purchased what little was left of the Langston legacy. Not to revive it, to repurpose it. The mahogany desk he once lorded over, sold. The chandelier in the main hall, auctioned. His stock holdings, his yacht, even the watch collection my mother boasted about in fashion magazines, liquidated. Not a trophy for me, a war chest for justice. I launched the Ember Initiative 6 weeks later. It wasn't flashy. There was no viral campaign, no public splash. Just a simple website, a modest press release, and a mission that was crystal clear. To fund second chances for those society forgot. Abused youth, abandoned teens, and veterans left behind. The first call I made was to a VA clinic in Maryland I'd once volunteered at during my early years in the Army. They were struggling with budget cuts buried under red tape, and their PTSD program was about to collapse. We'll cover the entire year, I said. The woman on the phone, a nurse I remembered named Shannon, started crying before I finished the sentence. The second call I made was to a halfway home for teen runaways in Ohio. I remembered their name from the files we'd uncovered. Langston Realty had indirectly caused the displacement of over 50 families in the area. They didn't know who I was. They just knew someone cared. We funded scholarships, counseling programs, mobile clinics, legal aid for veterans, reentry housing. One by one, we rebuilt pieces of the world my family helped destroy, and I kept my name off everything. This wasn't about redemption in the public eye. This was about peace in my own mind. Then came the letters. At first, they trickled in. Then they poured. Former employees, displaced tenants, victims of corporate fraud, people whose lives were bulldozed by Langston Holdings or its hundreds of shell subsidiaries. Some wrote in pain, some wrote in rage, but some wrote with hope, saying the grants they'd received, the therapy they now attended, or the rent they no longer had to fear had given them something they hadn't felt in years. Safety. One letter came from a man named Carlos. He had once worked as a maintenance tech in one of Langston's industrial facilities. After a chemical leak left him partially blind, he was fired, denied a settlement, and blackballed from similar work. He had tried to sue. He lost. In his letter, he wrote, "I didn't expect a miracle. I just wanted someone to remember I existed. What you're doing, it gave me my humanity back." I called him personally. We spoke for 42 minutes. He never once asked why I was doing this. But at the end, he said quietly, "Whoever you are, thank you for standing up to the people who stepped on us, even if they were your blood." That's when I told him, and his silence said everything. He didn't forgive me for the Langston name, but he respected what I'd done with it. That was enough. 6 months after the foundation's launch, Dana arranged for a small panel event in Washington. Survivors, advocates, and community leaders were invited. I was asked to speak. I almost didn't go. Public speaking was never the goal. I didn't want recognition. But when I walked into that room and saw the faces, the people who had suffered under the weight of my family's legacy, I knew I had to say something. Not for applause, for closure. So I stepped up to the podium, cleared my throat, and said, I was born into a legacy I didn't choose. A name that gave me everything in material comfort and took everything else in spirit. I was ignored, silenced, and cast aside by the very people who claimed to love me. And for years, I ran from that name. I let their shame define me. But then I realized something. We don't have to carry the guilt of others, but we can choose what we do with what they leave behind. I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I came to build something better. Not for them, but for you. This name, this money, this foundation, it doesn't belong to the Langstons. It belongs to every person they try to silence. And I promise you, silence ends with me. There was no cheering, just quiet nods, and a peace I hadn't known since I was a child. Later that night, I returned to my townhouse. The lights were low, the city quiet. I sat by the window, nursing a glass of water, and looked out over the skyline. The Langston name was gone from every building. But somewhere out there, a veteran was in therapy instead of sleeping on the street. A girl who'd been kicked out of her home had a bed and a social worker. A man who'd gone blind and won. I had dental insurance for the first time in 20 years. And the boy I used to be, the one they laughed at, pushed away, called worthless, finally had something to say. Not with words, but with action. The Langston name didn't die. It evolved. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't haunted by it. I was proud of it, because I'd rebuilt it. Not in their image, but in mine. The prison smelled like bleach and resignation. Every hallway echoed with the distant hum of flickering fluorescence, the kind of sound that vibrated just beneath hearing, quiet enough to ignore, loud enough to never forget. I walked through the final checkpoint, passed my ID to the officer, and stepped through the thick, buzzing security door that separated the free from the forgotten. Inmate number 42853. Jameson Langston. My father. I hadn't said his name aloud in years. Not in conversation. Not in thought. When the headlines came, when the trials aired, when the judgments were handed down, I let the justice system use his name. I didn't need to. Now, I was here to say goodbye. Not to him. To the last remaining shadow he had ever cast over me. The visitation room was cold and sterile. Rows of bolted chairs. Plexiglass barriers with scratched-up phone receivers. Other inmates already seated, facing family or lawyers or ghosts from their past. I sat where I was told. 3 minutes later, a guard escorted him in. He looked smaller, thinner. His once dominant frame had sunken, like the air had been let out of his confidence. No suit, no Rolex, no entourage, just an orange jumpsuit and the faded stare of a man who had finally learned that no amount of control could outmaneuver time. He sat down across from me. Neither of us picked up the phone right away. He just looked at me. Really looked, like he was trying to figure out if I was real or a dream he'd had somewhere in the middle of a lonely night. Finally, I lifted the receiver. He followed suit. Zane, he said first. That voice, still gravelly, still low and firm, like he expected the world to bend just because he was speaking. I heard about the foundation, he continued. Ember Initiative, is it? I didn't respond. He let the silence hang. Your mother's in Florida, he added. House arrest. She plays tennis with the other criminals in white collars and fake pearls. I assume you've seen the tabloids. More silence. I wasn't here for updates. I was here for truth. He leaned in slightly. What do you want, son? And there it was. That word. Son. The word he'd withheld like currency. The one he only used when the cameras were watching, when he needed to look like a father, not just a manufacturer of lineage. I met his eyes. I want you to answer a question. His brow lifted. All right, I'll let the quiet linger a second longer. Then I asked, did you ever love me? He blinked. Once. Then he sat back, phone still to his ear, and didn't speak for several long seconds. Love, he muttered. You think that's what this was about? No, Olivia. That's why I'm asking. He looked down at the scratch table between us. His fingers trembled slightly. Not from age, I realized, but from something rarer. Recognition. I didn't know how, he admitted. I wasn't asking for an excuse. It's not an excuse, he said sharply. It's a confession. He looked up at me again. I saw something in you I couldn't control. That scared me. You didn't want the spotlight. You didn't crave the power. You weren't like your brother. You were quiet. Too quiet. And every time I looked at you, I saw judgment. Even as a boy, I didn't say anything. I thought if I made you feel small, he said, I could make you manageable, moldable. But instead you just disappeared. No, I said calmly. I didn't disappear. You stopped looking. He stared at me. That old fire rising for a second in his eyes. The part of him that hated being told he'd made a mistake. But he didn't argue. He just nodded. And that, somehow, meant more than any apology could have. I'm not here to punish you, I continued. The courts handled that. You're here. That's justice. He nodded again, more slowly this time. I came because there's a boy I used to be. He still wakes up some nights, wondering if he was ever enough. I needed to look you in the eye and tell him. He was. A pause. And you were wrong. He didn't flinch. I can live with that, he said. Because you were right about me. The visit was timed. 20 minutes, maximum. We have 5 left. He looked down at his hands. They were clasped together now. Fidgeting. That was new. I still have money, he said, almost to himself. Offshore. Untraced. You could have it. It's yours. I shook my head once. I have all I need. You don't even know the number. I don't need the number. I have a name. He looked up again, puzzled. Mina Ikledefert. Not Langston. Zane. Not a piece of an empire. A man who built his own legacy. I used to hate that name, I added. It felt like an anchor, dragging me into a family I didn't belong to. But now, it's not yours anymore. It's mine. I took it back. I rebuilt it. And not with money or manipulation. With meaning. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing like he wanted to argue, but didn't. You know, he said, almost whispering, if you had just played along, you could have inherited everything. I did, I said, rising from my chair. I inherited the ashes, and from them, I built something real. I placed the receiver back on its cradle. He just sat there, still holding his. And for once, Jameson Langston had no more words. Outside, the sky was slate gray, the kind of afternoon that felt like the world was holding its breath. I stood in the parking lot, letting the silence wash over me. No entouraje, no flashing cameras, no applause. Just air, just space. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Not at him. Not at her. Not even at the boy who once cried into his pillow wondering what was wrong with him. He wasn't broken. He was becoming. A week later, I filed a legal petition to permanently dissolve what was left of Langston Holdings. The final shell company was buried. No board meetings. No tax filings. No future deals. Just a grave. I held a small, private ceremony. Not a funeral. More like a symbolic send-off. Dana was there. Carlos came, too. So did Shannon from the VA. We stood in front of a stone marker, blank, except for one line chiseled into its surface. A legacy built on power will fall to silence. A legacy built on truth will rise to echo. We each dropped something into the fire pit nearby, a relic of the past. A cufflink, a letter, a photograph, a broken pocket watch. When it was my turn, I dropped the Langston Holdings business card. Then I stepped back and watched it burn. Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment. No sound, just a breeze drifting through the open window. I opened my journal and wrote, I'm not the boy they ignored. I am not the failure they expected. I am not the name they tainted. I am Zane. I am the storm they didn't see coming. I am the silence that spoke louder than money. I am the man I needed to become. I closed the journal, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had anything to prove. Not to them, not to the world, not even to myself, because I'd won. Not just the war, but the peace that followed. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this.